Alright, hi everyone. This is Miss Bell, back with you for the second to last story from 145th Street. And we are here on page 117, and we are reading a story in 3 parts. Part 1, Doll. Big Time Henson stood on the stoop in front of 171st West, 145th Street, and thought about what he had to do. There were 3 flights to climb to Miss Pat's house. The old woman would be awake now, thinking about going shopping as she did every afternoon. She'd ask him to go with her downtown to La Margareta, and he would say no. And then she would tell him about things that happened back in the day when La Margareta would be filled with fresh food just brought into the city and fresh fish laid out neatly on beds of cracked ice. "You could smell the spices as soon as you got off the trolley," she would say. As soon as you got off the trolley. The nut-brown woman had probably been beautiful when she was young, Big Time thought. He imagined his great-grandmother, smartly dressed, walking through the streets of Harlem. Big Time couldn't imagine trolleys on 125th Street, but he would nod his approval and wait on the edge of his world until she had exhausted her stories, and then he would ask her to lend him a few dollars. On the way up the stairs, he began to feel sick. Once he stopped and took deep breaths, trying to calm himself, trying to get himself into the role that he had to play. It was no use. By the time he reached her floor, he realized that it was too late for anything but to ask her up front for the money. "You're looking thin," Miss Pat said. "Are you eating enough?" "I'm eating enough," Big Time said. "You know, when you were real little, they used to call you Penny." Miss Pat took Ritz crackers from the closet and put them on the table. "I don't know how you got to be called Big Time. Penny and Big Time aren't even close. I don't like nicknames anyway." "So you think you can spare a few dollars?" Big Time wiped away a thin edge of sweat from his upper lip. "Have I ever told you about a woman named Doll in our family history?" She sat down in front of the refrigerator, her hands folded on the edge of the table. "Who's Doll?" he asked. He had asked. She hadn't said no. "Doll was a slave woman," Miss Pat said. "She was on a plantation down near Montgomery. She had 2 children, and she had a man she loved. They weren't married because the slaves couldn't get married like the white folks could." "You think you could lend me the money?" Waves of nausea hit him. He sucked air through his clenched teeth. "The whites lived in the plantation house. They used to call it the Big House," Miss Pat went on. "And the coloreds lived about a quarter mile in back of the plantation house in a little row of shacks they called the quarters. When I was a student at Talladega College, me and Edward, your great-grandfather, went over to see the plantation. You know, he was a great one for studying history. Do you know that?" "Yeah, I remember," Big Time answered. "Okay if I open the window?" "Sure, baby, I know how the heat can get to you sometimes." "Please stop and pause. Answer questions 1 and 2. The window was already partially open, and he pulled it all the way up. In the street below, some boys were playing basketball using a milk crate as a hoop. Some older men were playing dominoes. Young men stood on the corner, as they always did, watching. "So, what happened to Doll?" he said, hoping to hurry the story. "Doll didn't live in the quarters with the other coloreds," Miss Pat said. "She lived in a little room in the back of the kitchen in the big house. What she did was to help the master's wife around the house, and things went all right as far as it went, with Doll not being free and everything. The master was an old man, and he did pretty good. They raised cotton and hogs on the plantation. You want something to eat?" "No," Big Time said. "I'm not hungry." "Then things got hard," Miss Pat went on. "I don't know why. Guess that's the way the farming business goes, and the master started selling his slaves." "Things were hard," Big Time said. He glanced up at the square clock on the wall over the stove. It was 2:30. Sweet Jimmy would be back from downtown with a pocket full of dimes. When Doll saw he was selling his people, she went to him and begged him not to sell her, Miss Pat said. You know, when they sold them from Alabama and they all went down to Mississippi, it was really hard on them. And then they would be separated from the people they knew, other colored people. So the master promised he wouldn't sell Doll. But one day, a speculator came by. You know what a speculator was? No, look, I have to go, Big Time said, standing. Well, I'm sorry you couldn't spend more time with me today, Miss Pat said, folding her hands in her lap. There was a calmness in her voice, an evenness of tone that Big Time recognized. She knew he was sick. Can you lend me the money? He asked again. A speculator was one of those people who went from plantation to plantation, looking for slaves they could buy, Miss Pat said. Big Time sat down. Street noises drifted up from the street, the roar of buses, a fire engine's wail, snatches of music. Please pause and answer questions 3 and 4. The master had sold about as many slaves as he could sell without having to shut down his farming, Miss Pat said. And so when the speculator came by, the slaves that were left thought they were pretty safe. They were out in the fields working, and all of a sudden a young black girl came running out across the field. Master's selling the children, she shouted. Well, you could imagine what the reaction was to that. They were out in the field working, and the speculator is ready to take off their children. That's how cruel slavery times were. The woman in the field started back towards the big house. The overseer tried to stop them. He hit at them with his whip and tried to block them, but they were determined. You know, those women loved their children. Just because a person was a slave didn't mean they didn't have feelings the same as everybody else. Well, anyway, they all got to the big house just as the speculator was putting the children on his wagon to carry them off. Oh, they begged and they pleaded and they begged. The children he was selling were too young to know what was going on, but when they saw their mamas crying, they began to cry too. But the master wasn't listening. Now, they said he wasn't a particularly cruel man, if you can believe that, but he had just fallen on hard times, and he had done what he had done, and he wasn't backing up. Doll, I guess, she'd be your great-great-grandmother, or something like that, went to her mistress and begged her, knowing that another woman would understand how she felt. What Doll begged her to do is just to let her hold her babies in her arms once more before they went off. She knew once they were off with the speculator, she would never see them again. The mistress of the plantation liked Doll, and she said she could say goodbye to her boys, but she had to do it quick, because the speculator didn't have much time to waste. He was taking the children into Montgomery. The mistress told Doll that the children would go to all homes and be raised as house servants. Please pause. Answer questions 5 and 6. Doll thanked her mistress and took her babies into the cabin she stayed in, and she hugged them boys and hugged them and kissed them and told them how much she loved them. And after a while, the speculator got itchy and said he had to move on, and the mistress sent another slave woman into Doll's cabin to get the children. But when the woman came out, she didn't go up to the mistress, but just started walking out to the fields. The mistress called to her and threatened to have her beat good, but she didn't turn back. Finally, the mistress went into Doll's cabin herself to see what was going on. When she got into the cabin, she saw Doll was still holding the boys in her arms and rocking them. The mistress went up to Doll to tell her that she must let the children go, and that's when she saw the blood. Miss Pat got up from the table and went to the cupboard. She moved aside a box of tea bags and brought out a small purse. It wasn't usual for women to kill their children during slavery times, Miss Pat said, but it happened. I think it was something that stayed on their minds a lot, even when they wouldn't do it. You know, looking at your children and being filled up with love, and at the same time knowing that it was going to be a slave all its life must have been so hard. She killed them? Sometimes you got to get your freedom the best way you can, Miss Pat said. Well, what happened to Doll? Big Time said. She get free? Well, she got whipped, Miss Pat said. That's the story that was handed down. And you know what? What? Sometimes when I think about that story, you know what I think about? Miss Pat took $7 from the money she had and put it down in front of Big Time. I don't think about them children dying, which is what you would think I would think about. I think about how Doll must have felt being whipped. Isn't it funny? I just think about her being tied down and that overseer or whoever it was doing the whipping trying to hurt her. You think there's just so much pain you could put on a person? Big Time said he didn't know. He tried to think about Doll and about how she must have felt, but his thoughts were already moved away. I can't even imagine trolleys on 125th Street, he said, instantly recognizing the heavy awkwardness of what he was saying. Well, it was a long time ago, Miss Pat answered. When Big Time reached the street, a man was arguing with a policeman while a tow truck hooked up his car. Big Time watched for a little moment, then started toward the avenue. He told himself that he would have to remember the story she had told him about Doll, in case she asked him again. Please pause and answer questions 7 and 8. Part 2, Sweet Jimmy. Sweet Jimmy ran this thing behind where the old bicycle shop used to be before the landlord busted it down. He always had 2 heavies sitting in front of his place and 2 pit bulls to keep the man off his case. The man could collar the heavies, but if they didn't, they would just let the dogs loose and the bus would be wrecked out. Big Time showed green and went past the heavies. Inside the front room, a couple of dudes were watching a talk show on television. Yo, Sonny, what's up? Ain't nothing going on, Big Time answered to his tag. You just chillin'? Yeah, something like that, Fish said. You should check out these Snow Whites on the tube, man. They've each got 2 boyfriends, and they're messing with both of them. That's the thing, Big Time said. You think you're playing a babe, and they're playing you. Word, but I want to go on no television and let the whole world know about it, man, Fish said. You would if they offered you some presidents. Big Time didn't know the other dude. You can cop the money and then let the babes walk. Yeah, I hear ya, Big Time said. He was feeling sick again. Sweet Jimmy in the back? Yeah. Big Time stepped through the curtain that separated the front room from the back. It was dark, and he stood in the doorway, trying to get his eyes right, knowing he wouldn't. There was a radio on, and somebody was flowing strong, but Big Time couldn't figure out who it was. Yo, Sweet Jimmy, what's happening? You are, if you're righteous, Sweet Jimmy's voice came from around the corner. Big Time squinted and found Sweet Jimmy's shape. He went over to him and took out the small wad of bills he had counted over and over again in Miss Pat's hallway. Sweet Jimmy looked at the bills, counted them out, then threw them into a cardboard box. Please pause and answer 9 and 10. Sweet Jimmy handed Big Time the syringe and said something that Big Time couldn't quite catch. What he told himself was that he was going to have to wait it out, stay away from the tracks, and just skin pop, hold off the nausea and mellow out slow. He was down with the easy way. You need help? Big Time looked up and saw the kid that Sweet Jimmy let hang around. The kid could find a vein in the dark if you needed that kind of help. Ain't going there, Big Time said. He found a chair against the wall, sat down, and took a deep breath, and then slid the point of the needle under the skin inside his wrist. He hoped the stuff wasn't weak. Sweet Jimmy wasn't known for the weak stuff. Sweet Jimmy was straight, which is why so many people turned to Sweet Jimmy when they needed to get it right. Please continue reading on your own and answering the questions.